The silent battlefield, where victory is measured in silence. You are lying down now, perhaps seeking rest, perhaps seeking escape. But before you drift, consider this. The greatest manual of warfare ever written, Sun Tzu's Art of War, is not meant to be studied on the screaming field of conflict. It is meant to be studied right here, in the quiet, when the noise of the world is muffled, and your mind is finally ready to confront its truest opponent, itself. We are not seeking action tonight. We are seeking profound inaction. True power, true strategy, is discovered when you stop fighting the outside world and start listening to the geography of your interior landscape. You cannot master the world until you master the quiet mechanics of your own decision-making. How much time do we spend preparing for visible conflict, the deadlines, the arguments, the social maneuvering, and how little time do we spend mastering the primary domain of strategy? That is the quiet core of Sun Tzu's lasting power, the understanding that the most crucial victories are those earned before the fight ever begins. We begin our strategic descent into the depths of your mind tonight, where every thought is a potential skirmish and every moment of rest is a chance to fortify your position. Are you ready to admit that the greatest strategic asset you possess is not your strength but your stillness? Are you ready to see the true location of your greatest battle? The silent battlefield, the paradox of unfought conflict. The manual demands that you win the war without ever drawing a sword. How do you conquer a realm you have not yet entered or defeat an opponent you haven't even provoked? Sun Tzu states, unequivocally, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is not a philosophy of pacifism. It is the ultimate expression of strategic dominance. It implies a total comprehension of the environment so thorough that your opponent sees the inevitable defeat inherent in your very presence and yields before the first move is made. It immediately moves the battlefield from the physical space of collision into the psychological space of perception and leverage. Tonight, we are dealing with preemptive wisdom, the kind that renders conflict utterly obsolete. We must first define the silent battlefield. It is the mental terrain where you shape the conditions of engagement long before the engagement materializes. It is the space where the strategic advantage is established, not exploited. Imagine two masters of the ancient game of Go sitting opposite each other. The board remains silent, yet the war is raging in the space between their ears. One player moves a single stone. The opponent stares not at the stone itself, but at the implications of the stone, the 5 subsequent moves, the territory it silently threatens, the structural weakness it exposes 3 turns down the line. Seeing the future move is easy. Seeing the future implication is strategy. The silent battlefield is that mental space where you calculate the consequence of action to such a depth that the necessity of direct reactive action fades away. Here lies the exhausting paradox. Strategy demands total foresight, yet for most of us, foresight paralyzes us into reactive hesitation. We mistake busy work for strategic action. We associate power with loud, visible exertion, the emails sent at midnight, the aggressive counter-argument. But Sun Tzu defines strategic excellence by the sheer absence of visible effort. If you find yourself struggling openly, if you are exerting maximal visible force, you have already failed the primary test of strategy. The underlying mechanism of the silent battlefield reveals that true power lies in shaping the conditions of the conflict so meticulously that your opponent's freedom to move is subtly choked off, not by brutal force, but by the sheer, undeniable logic of the situation you have engineered. You win not because you fought harder, but because you structured the game so that every move your opponent attempts only benefits you. This concept is profoundly applicable to the modern, relentlessly competitive landscape of decision-making. Your silent battlefield isn't the boardroom or the social media feed. It is the few minutes before you open that crucial email or the reflective space before you make a major commitment. Do you rush into reactive defense, letting the external world dictate your movements, or do you strategically structure the environment first? A person who masters the silent battlefield doesn't waste energy arguing every tiny point in a dispute. They frame the discussion so cleanly, so logically, that opposing arguments collapse under the weight of their own inherent contradictions. They win by making the other party realize, internally and without coercion, that their position is strategically unsustainable. This is the difference between arguing to win and structuring the conversation so that only victory is possible. What changes inside you when you begin to occupy this mental ground? You shift fundamentally from being a reactor, a highly optimized, anxiety-ridden pawn waiting for external stimulus, to being an architect. The crippling anxiety of uncertainty diminishes because you have already mentally rehearsed the worst-case scenario and structured the environment to make it highly improbable. This mastery fosters a deep psychological calm, the unshakable confidence that comes not from believing you can physically endure a fight, but from knowing, with cold, analytical certainty, that you don't need to fight. You achieve a state of relaxed vigilance, because the crucial work has already been performed in the silence. The greatest victories are not those cheered by the crowds, shouted over the din of battle, or validated by visible conquest. They are the conflicts you silently log in the private ledger of your own consciousness. They are the wars that evaporated before dawn simply because you had already won them while the world slept. This quiet mastery is the first secret of Sun Tzu. Knowing the other is strategy. Knowing yourself is the ultimate dilemma. The paradox of self-knowledge, the terrain you never map. We spend our days mapping the contours of the external world, the market shifts, the competitor's weakness, the social climate. But as the external noise fades and the room grows heavy with the coming sleep, tell me, are you confident you've mapped the borders of your own internal empire? We navigate the public sphere with a laser focus, calculating risks and optimizing outcomes based on measurable data. Yet, the moment we are alone, we confront the unsettling reality that the most powerful force shaping our future is the one we least understand, the volatile architecture of the self. Sun Tzu, the ultimate strategist, offered a simple binary. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. We instinctively grasp the utility of knowing the enemy. They are external, measurable, predictable to a degree. They occupy physical space. We dedicate immense energy to studying their formation, their strengths, their supply lines. But the true difficulty, the profound source of the ultimate dilemma, lies in the second half of that mandate, knowing yourself. Why? Because the enemy outside is finite. The enemy within, the self, is constantly shifting, redefining its loyalties and redrawing its map. Imagine your inner world not as a solid, dependable fortress, but as an ancient, subterranean labyrinth constructed by contradictory engineers. Every instinct you follow, every decision you justify, requires traversing this unlit terrain. You believe you know the main roads, your ambition, your core values, but when crisis hits, or when the quiet of the night allows introspection, you find hidden chambers, locked doors, and long-forgotten tunnels leading to motives you didn't consciously authorize. You discover resentments you thought you'd dissolved, fears you believed you had conquered, and powerful latent desires that threaten the very structure of your current reality. The enemy you face outside may use feints and illusions, but the enemy within, the unknown self, uses truth. Truths you buried because they were inconvenient or too painful to integrate. The strategy we deploy externally is built upon the assumption of stability. We identify our resources, we calculate risk, and we project a consistent self into the negotiation. But genuine self-knowledge strips away that convenient facade. It forces you to confront the paradox that the greatest strength you claim, say, relentless persistence, is often the same source as your most painful vulnerability, an inability to sustain authentic surrender or rest. When you look inward, you don't find fixed points, you find tension. You find the impulse to grow battling the impulse toward comfort. You find the desire for genuine meaning struggling against the hunger for superficial validation. This is why self-knowledge is a dilemma, not a strategy. A strategy is a tool designed to win. Self-knowledge is the profound realization that the definition of winning must perpetually change. In the modern era, we try to cheat this dilemma. We outsource self-knowledge to algorithms, personality tests, and curated social media feeds that reflect back only the most flattering angles of our desired persona. We seek external affirmation as a substitute for internal verification. We become experts at strategic branding, masking the chaos beneath with clean lines and confident pronouncements. But that persona is not the self. It is merely the armor. And armor, while necessary for the field of battle, eventually becomes heavy and restrictive, trapping the very vitality it was meant to guard. If you mistake the armor for the body, you lose the ability to move, to adapt, or to truly feel. The true psychological weight of this realization is profound. When you accept that the map of the self will always be incomplete, that you are, in effect, a nation perpetually engaged in a civil war of desires, you cease striving for an impossible certainty. You move from rigid confidence, the belief that you know precisely who you are, to radical adaptability. You understand that your deepest resources often lie hidden behind walls of shame or fear, waiting only for your acceptance. The ultimate strategic edge isn't found in pinning down a final definition of the self, but in recognizing that the self is perpetually in motion, constantly reforming its front lines and redefining its objectives based on internal dialogue, not external pressure. To know yourself is to understand that the territory is alive, always growing, and often dangerous, but it is wholly yours. So, as you drift towards sleep, remember the fundamental difference between the two halves of the strategic mandate. Knowing the enemy provides the tactic for victory in the moment. Knowing yourself offers the wisdom to define the battlefield entirely. The goal of external strategy is mastery. The goal of internal awareness is freedom. The supreme art, winning by refusing the war. The unfought victory, strategy as omission. You are constantly preparing for battles that never arrive, aren't you? Your internal landscape is perpetually fortified against imagined slights and future confrontations. What if the greatest display of strength is not the force you exert, but the fight you quietly, systematically choose not to have? What if winning means rendering the conflict irrelevant before the first blow is even considered? Sun Tzu tells us that to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. This is not some passive retreat or an appeal to moral high ground. It is efficiency taken to its highest, most cynical strategic altitude. We waste an astonishing amount of finite resource, time, attention, emotional bandwidth, in preemptive defensiveness, in establishing boundaries just so they can be tested, or in responding to threats that only existed because we acknowledge their structure. The supreme art isn't maneuvering armies across a map. It is manipulating the conditions of existence so that opposition becomes illogical, unsustainable, or, most satisfyingly, irrelevant. It is winning the game by rendering the board unplayable to your opponent, not by capturing their pieces. Consider the master swordsman. He does not carry the heaviest, sharpest sword. He carries stillness. When challenged by an eager, aggressive novice, he doesn't meet the blow with a desperate, clashing parry. He simply shifts his weight just enough, steps slightly back, creating a vacuum where the opponent's predictable, momentum-driven attack dissipates uselessly into the air. The attacker exhausts themselves, not against resistance, but against nothingness. The master never drew steel. The battle concluded the moment the attacker realized their aggression had no viable target, only space. This, precisely, is the anatomy of the unfought victory. This kind of strategic omission demands a radical, almost terrifying degree of self-trust. We are fundamentally conditioned to equate effort with value, to see struggle as the prerequisite for worthiness. Our immediate visceral response to conflict, whether it's an aggressive email from a colleague or a societal dispute broadcast online, is escalation. We believe we must prove we are right. We must demonstrate our competence through vigorous defense. But the moment you engage the conflict, you validate its structure, you grant it precious energy, and you assign it a measurable place in your life. The inherent paradox of engagement is this: The only way to retain absolute sovereign control over a potential conflict is to never enter its gravitational pull. Every defensive wall you laboriously build is, simultaneously, a constraint on your own freedom of movement. Every retaliatory action you execute is a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement of the opponent's power over your mood, your focus, and your internal economy. The mechanism of the unfought victory is, therefore, the strategic withdrawal of ego. Think now about the conflicts that are draining you in this quiet moment, the persistent, corrosive argument you have with a silent coworker, the subtle pressure to always defend your creative choices to those who misunderstand them, the endless internal monologue fighting past mistakes that have already resolved themselves. You are spending irreplaceable strategic resources on structural conflicts that offer no genuine, lasting reward, only the temporary, fleeting satisfaction of having the last word, the successful counter-argument. You are willingly fighting ghost wars when your resources should be deployed toward actual creation and forward movement. You are giving away your sovereignty, dollar by precious dollar, to those who value the drama more than the outcome. When you master this refusal to engage, you fundamentally alter your relationship with external force. You cease seeking validation through confrontation. The resulting psychological shift is profound. Your sense of self is no longer derived from your ability to successfully overcome external opposition, but from your sheer, unshakable imperviousness to being pulled into the drama in the first place. You are operating from a higher plane of strategic reality, one the opponent cannot access because they are still bound by the need to fight. You are liberated by the silent recognition that the fight itself is optional. This strategic silence, this quiet omission, this absence of resistance becomes your most potent weapon. It breeds confusion in those who expect immediate friction, forcing them, eventually, to confront the instability of their own unnecessary aggression. True power whispers, it does not roar. Sleep now, knowing that the greatest victories you will ever claim are the ones you quietly, perfectly avoided. Few arrive here awake. Leave your mark with a like. It helps this reflection reach others who seek truth before sleep. The paradox of strength, the utility of visible weakness. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward a profound contradiction woven into the fabric of power itself. The paradox of strength, which argues for the utility of visible weakness. Have you ever felt the crushing, exhausting weight of having to maintain absolute perfection? The unbearable pressure of standing permanently alert, constantly projecting the image of invincibility? That armor, while protective, eventually becomes a cage, trapping you in a perpetual state of performance. Tonight, in this quiet darkness, we explore the secret strategic utility of letting that armor slip, just a little. Sun Tzu surprisingly dedicates very little time to discussing absolute strength. He is obsessed with relative positioning and the manipulation of perception. The ultimate goal is not to win every fight, but to avoid fighting unnecessary ones, and more importantly, to control the terms of engagement. The utility of visible weakness is the deliberate strategic choice to appear less powerful, less threatening, or less deserving of attention than you truly are. It is camouflage applied directly to ambition. It is the art of lowering the target. Consider the metaphor of the empty boat. Imagine you are sailing on a crowded river. If your vessel is laden with rare silks and shining silver, brightly polished and visibly valuable, everyone will give you wide berth out of necessity, or potentially scheme to ram you and claim salvage. But if your boat appears old, empty, and adrift, a simple, abandoned hull, and it bumps into a powerful warship, the captain of that warship will only swear under his breath and move on. There is no gain in attacking the empty boat. There is no penalty in forgiving it. Your perceived lack of value protects the integrity of your structure. The ship is safe, not because of its formidable defenses, but because of its strategic presentation of worthlessness. This is where the paradox reveals its sharpest edges. When you project overwhelming strength, you inherently attract competition. You become the singular point of focus for every aspiring rival and every desperate enemy. By presenting yourself as the strongest possible link in the chain, you invite others to test that link until it snaps. Yet, when you allow for visible flaws, not catastrophic failings, but strategic vulnerabilities, managed deficiencies, or simple human needs, you achieve critical tactical victories. First, you hoard your true power. The enemy, underestimating your reserve, allocates fewer resources against you. Second, you elicit resources from others. People are far more willing to assist the struggling, the human, the person who acknowledges difficulty, than they are willing to assist the untouchable, flawless titan. Genuine connection and strategic aid often flow to the point of perceived need, not the point of perceived perfection. Third, and perhaps most importantly, you remove the target painted brightly on your back. The truly aggressive seeker of power bypasses the seemingly weak opponent in favor of a more impressive, higher status confrontation. You become strategically uninteresting to those you cannot afford to fight. How does this principle manifest in the reality you inhabit right now? In your career, are you exhausting yourself trying to look bulletproof to your superiors, stifling innovation by refusing to admit confusion? In your relationships, are you demanding so much emotional invulnerability from yourself that you prevent others from truly seeing and supporting you? Showing weakness in a controlled manner is an invitation for genuine assistance, an act of trust that disarms petty rivalry, and a necessary strategic tactic for resource management. It is the conscious ability to delegate expectation. To understand the utility of visible weakness is to give yourself internal permission to breathe. It shifts your power source away from constant performance anxiety and toward controlled strategic revelation. The psychological impact is immense. You are no longer defined by the exhausting necessity of appearing invincible. You realize that sometimes the highest form of defense is simply becoming strategically invisible, becoming strategically uninteresting to those who would seek to drain your resources. So remember this before you finally drift off. Sometimes, the safest, most resilient fortress is the one that has been strategically mistaken for a ruin. Lower your target tonight. Allow the armor to rest. Sleep now, and consider the immense strategic value in the strengths you might choose to leave hidden tomorrow. Planned chaos, the architecture of necessary collapse. You are lying here, perhaps striving for inner stillness. But notice how stillness, when prolonged, can sometimes feel like stagnation. The question isn't how to maintain perfect order. The strategic question is how to deliberately dismantle the false order you have built around yourself. This is the heart of the concept we call planned chaos, the architecture of necessary collapse. It is an idea that fundamentally defies our modern, relentless pursuit of continuous growth and unbroken stability. Necessary collapse is the deliberate architectural introduction of friction, of controlled entropy, into a system that has grown too rigid, too comfortable, too heavy. Sun Tzu understood that the army that refuses to move, that clings too tightly to its established supply lines and fortifications, is the army already defeated. Brittleness precedes breakage. True strategic genius lies not in preventing disruption, but in mastering its timing and scope. Think about the architecture of natural systems. Imagine an old-growth forest. For decades, it seems perfectly stable, its canopy thick and its root structure robust. But the deadwood piles up year after year, blocking the sunlight, draining nutrients, choking the saplings beneath. The only true regenerative force is the inevitable cleansing fire, the controlled burn. This fire looks, on the surface, like absolute destruction. It is deafening, terrifying, and consuming. But it is, in reality, a meticulously planned redistribution of resources, a reset mechanism encoded into the ecosystem itself. It destroys the superficial accumulation so that the deep foundation can thrive. The paradox here is deeply psychological. We fear loss above all else. Yet the greatest losses we suffer are often losses of agency, trapped by structures we designed for temporary comfort. We build a successful routine, a successful identity, or a successful relationship, and then we mistakenly believe the goal is to protect that static structure forever. We become the warden of our own success. The mechanism of necessary collapse demands preemptive sacrifice. You must recognize when a solution has passed its expiration date, even if it is still functionally sound. The cost of maintaining an optimal yet outdated strategy will always outweigh the immediate pain of tearing it down. This is the difference between a crisis that happens to you and a necessary collapse that you initiate. When you wait for external forces to break your structures, you are a victim of chaos. When you initiate the collapse, you become the architect of renewal. Think about the architecture of your own life right now, in the quiet of this moment. Where have you allowed comfort to replace clarity? When do you cling to a relationship, a job title, or a self-image, not because it still serves your core strength, but because the alternative, the collapse, would be too loud, too messy, or too disruptive to your narrative of success? That heavy silence, that sense of inertia, that lack of friction is the sign of impending brittleness. It means the system is no longer testing itself. To embrace planned chaos is to fundamentally redefine failure. Failure is not the definitive end of the line. It is merely a resource allocation event. It is the internal system telling you precisely where the fault lines lie, where the foundation is weak, and what unnecessary weight must be shed. When you move past the fear of the noise and recognize that you must sometimes burn down the successful structure of yesterday, you move from the posture of a victim to the authority of an architect. True stability is not found in stillness, but in relentless, strategic reinvention. The willingness to initiate the necessary collapse, to burn down the map so you can finally see the territory. Sleep on the embers. They are the seeds of the next forest. The strategic void, the power of allowing self-destruction. The sixth principle, the strategy of the decaying structure. Have you ever felt the profound relief of stopping the fight, not because you surrendered, but because you recognized that the thing you were fighting was already dedicated to its own downfall? This is where true non-action becomes the most devastating action. In the ancient texts, there is a strategy often overlooked because it requires profound patience and iron discipline. The strategic void. It is the art of watching the inevitable unwind. We are conditioned to seek control, to build walls, to rush toward the point of failure with rescue ropes. But the strategist understands that certain structures, be they rival empires, flawed business plans, or destructive habits, carry the seed of their own destruction, a kind of internal entropy that accelerates when unopposed. Your job is not to push. Your job is to step back and allow the predetermined trajectory to play out fully. Imagine a vast, imposing ice palace built upon a spring thaw. It looks solid, intimidating. The untrained eye believes the danger lies in attacking it and throwing stones. But the master strategist simply waits, observing the cracks forming beneath the surface as the temperature slowly rises. Any attempt to dismantle the palace externally simply allows the architect to adjust and reinforce. The true move is to remove the pressure entirely, to let the internal melting accelerate. When the architect realizes their own foundations are failing, the energy shifts from defense to frantic, impossible internal repair. The greatest failure of a flawed system is not the attack it endures, but the defense it cannot sustain against itself. This mechanism relies entirely on the universal truth of momentum. A falling object accelerates faster than one that is pushed. When you intervene against a system that is inherently destructive, you unintentionally become its external support. You give it a target, you give it validation, you give it a narrative of noble struggle against an aggressor. You become the distraction that allows it to ignore its fatal internal rot. The strategic void demands that you endure the sight of the other's escalating errors without offering a single countermove. It forces the opponent to look inward, where they will find not stability, but the structural weakness they built themselves. The tension you feel is the desire to prove you are right, but true strategic power is exercised in the silence where the truth is proven naturally. How often do we apply this costly intervention to our own lives? We engage in toxic conversations, trying desperately to win an argument with someone whose entire worldview is built on a foundation of shifting sand. We try to save a relationship that has already decided to crumble. We fight an addiction by throwing every resource at it, when perhaps the only true move is to stop feeding the friction, to let the inherent instability of the pattern finally fall under its own weight. The constant struggle to correct others often stems from our own fear of silence and stillness, our anxiety about the chaos that ensues when we refuse to shoulder burdens that are not ours. The true transformation occurs within you, the observer. To successfully execute the strategy of the decaying structure, you must master the ego's demand for action. It requires a radical acceptance that you are not responsible for holding up the world. It is a powerful philosophical pivot from control to discernment. You stop seeing the world as a series of problems needing repair and start seeing it as a dynamic system governed by laws of physics and psychology. You are not a savior, you are a catalyst of truth, ensuring that internal weakness is revealed rather than hidden by your interference. This choice grants you the ultimate quiet power, the patience to watch the truth unfold on its own timeline. Your silence, when employed strategically, is not emptiness. It is the perfect calibrated vacuum necessary for the collapse of a lie. The sound of a structure falling under its own weight is the purest form of victory. The gravity of silence, the true weight of the unspoken word. Tonight, we contemplate the strategy of the necessary void. You spend your days fighting for clarity, for the right words, believing that the articulated truth is the ultimate tool for influence. But pause now, feel the quiet settling around you. The deepest wells of command are often found not in the rhetoric you deploy, but in the calculated absence of it, the intentional silence. This is not the silence of confusion, the blank mind searching for a thought, but the strategic void, a conscious refusal to commit information, allowing the environment to generate its own gravity around your mystery. You believe power lies in articulation, but true command often resides in the space you refuse to fill. This is the weight of the unspoken word. Imagine the universe's ultimate power, the black hole. It does not speak, it does not argue, it does not advertise its intentions. Its influence, its immense crushing gravity, stems entirely from its ability to absorb light, absorb sound, absorb certainty. You are drawn toward it not by what it broadcasts, but by the profound vacuum it sustains. When you choose strategic silence, you become that gravitational center in any interaction. Others rush to fill the void you created, projecting their own fears, assumptions, and intentions onto the blank canvas you've provided. Their noise becomes the echo of your composure. The mechanism of strategic silence reveals a deep paradox of control. When faced with high stakes, the natural, desperate instinct is to over-explain, to justify, to defend the borders of your certainty. This impulse, however, is a weakness. It gives away your emotional coordinates and depletes your reserves. The strategic thinker understands that the discomfort felt by others is amplified by their inability to penetrate your calm composure. They are begging you to speak, not necessarily for resolution, but for relief from the uncertainty you have induced. The silence becomes an active, muscular resistance, subtly revealing that you possess information or assurance that they lack. This is where the tension resides. The longer you hold the silence, the heavier the unspoken word becomes, both for those waiting to hear it and for you, who must bear the psychological burden of its containment. Consider your daily life, the nerve-wracking negotiation, the tense board meeting, the heated disagreement with a loved one. Who speaks first after the tension peaks? Who rushes to apologize or offer concessions just to break the uncomfortable quiet? Often, the victor in that silent standoff is the one who understands the existential value of the pause. In an era saturated with immediate reaction, the reply button, the instant comment, the obligatory justification, the decision to withhold your response becomes a radical, almost subversive act. It forces the momentum of the situation back onto the originator of the conflict or question. demanding that they do the work of commitment and clarification while you merely observe their effort. You do not need to argue your position when your composure is evidence of your superior strategy. Psychologically, mastering the necessary void demands a profound internal shift. You must shed the frantic urgency that modern life imposes on every interaction. Urgency is the undisputed enemy of strategic depth. When you consciously embrace silence, you teach your mind patience, forcing it to observe the environment, the tells, and the intentions, rather than merely reacting to stimuli. You move from the position of the participant rushing toward the finish line to the conductor who alone sets the tempo of the entire symphony. The philosophical lesson here is simple yet terrifying. Control is often achieved by relinquishing the immediate need to prove that you have it. You don't need to argue your dominance. The sheer, immeasurable weight of your unuttered truth argues for you. The most effective word you will ever deploy is the one you choose to hold back, allowing its potential energy to resonate louder than any sound. Sleep now, and understand that sometimes the only way to speak true power is to listen to the immense silent gravity you cast. Time is co-conspirator, the existential patience of the predator. The concept we explore is the profound and necessary practice of strategic inaction, the ability to let the clock do the heavy lifting, allowing circumstances and your opponent's own momentum to work in your favor. How much of your perceived weakness, your current frustration, or your history of failure is merely the frantic need for premature action? Quiet yourself now, breathe deeply, and consider the immense leverage held by a moment that has not yet arrived. This is not about passive waiting. It is about the active deployment of duration. For the true strategist, time is not a finite resource to be frantically managed, but a relentless, neutral force to be deliberately deployed in the realm of high-stakes conflict, whether military, professional, or personal. The delay is not a vacuum of progress, but a critical phase of erosion. It is the phase where the enemy's own internal inconsistencies, their anxiety, and their unsustainable momentum are allowed to destroy them from within. This is the mastery of Shi, the potential energy inherent in a perfectly chosen position, a force that builds silently while the world assumes you are idle. Imagine the crocodile strategy. This ancient hunter does not engage in a frenzy of movement. It commits to an eternity of stillness in the muddy bank, expending only the minimal energy required for maintenance. The crocodile understands the fundamental laws of gravity, thirst, and expectation, forces that will inevitably draw the target closer, bringing them into the optimal kill zone. Its success is guaranteed not by the speed or ferocity of its final strike, but by the sustained, agonizing perfection of its position over hours, days, or even weeks. Its patience isn't a limitation, it is its primary weapon. Here lies the existential paradox. Strategic patience requires incredible internal exertion. It is a constant, subtle battle against the anxiety of visibility, the cultural urge to prove you are doing something, the ego's demand for immediate feedback. True predatory patience means mastering the internal self-talk and achieving a stillness so complete that the cost of waiting is far less than the inevitable cost of acting too soon. You are not passive when you are waiting. You are dynamically static. You are using the tension created by the absence of your movement, the silence, to shape and mold the environment around you. In the noise of modern life, we are conditioned to associate movement with value and constant visibility with competence. We mistake frantic activity for actual achievement. The strategic pause, however, is where genuine power is forged. When you refuse to answer the inflammatory email immediately, refuse to comment on the petty drama, or refuse to engage the low-hanging conflict, you are not retreating. You are preserving your focus and solidifying your long-term position. Every unnecessary action is an expenditure of energy that could be leveraged later. Every word you don't speak is information you retain. This strategic shift transforms your relationship with anxiety itself. Anxiety is often merely the mind's impatience demanding resolution now. When you accept time as your co-conspirator, you neutralize that frantic short-term energy. You realize that nearly all catastrophic failures, in war, in business, in relationships, are products of rushed timing, not inherently flawed planning. This grants you profound psychological safety. You gain the confidence of knowing that the field is still being shaped, and the silent, relentless sculptor is the ticking clock. Your deepest strength is the willingness to remain silent, unseen, and observant, waiting for the natural, slow decay of the unsustainable structures built by those who value speed over inevitability. Do not merely wait for time to pass. Wait for time to deliver the final, inevitable truth you have meticulously prepared for. The greatest power belongs to the one who moves last, because they move only once. The subtle art, daily deception, beginning with the self. The necessary fiction, when deception becomes self-creation. You believe you know yourself, don't you? You hold your flaws and your potential in clear, objective view, certain that authenticity requires absolute transparency. But tell me honestly, when was the last time you told yourself a necessary lie just to keep the machinery running? Sun Tzu famously declared, "All warfare is based on deception." We tend to interpret this solely in the external theater, fooling the enemy with false movements, ghost armies, or misleading intelligence. But the most sophisticated and crucial application of strategic deception is often reserved for the general who must fool himself. This is not about denial, which is a passive retreat from reality. This is about strategic self-narration, the conscious, intentional framing of reality, a psychological commitment to a desired future state as if it were already present. The necessary fiction is the hypothesis you choose to live inside until, through effort and sustained belief, it hardens into undeniable fact. Imagine the ancient general facing a formidable enemy force. He possesses the objective intelligence. He knows the odds are stacked against him. If he allows this fear, this pure, cold reality, to permeate his psyche and, worse, his camp, he is already lost before the first arrow flies. What does he do? He does not merely pretend confidence. He actively constructs a required narrative. He convinces himself and his men that the enemy is disorganized, that their supply lines are tenuous, that fate itself has predetermined their victory. The strategic mind never entirely loses sight of the underlying risk, but it acts as if the fabricated reality is true, channeling all available energy away from existential paralysis and toward decisive, energized action. That committed act of self-deception is the lever that unlocks strategic will. The mechanism at work reveals a profound conflict within the self, the tension between the observer and the actor. The observer is the cold, calculating mind, the part of you that knows the objective data and understands the true gravity of failure. The actor is the part of you that must engage, move, and execute tasks. Strategic self-deception mandates that the observer must temporarily yield control and feed the actor the optimal script, even if that script is a distortion. It's a temporary neurological firewall designed to bypass fear and doubt. You must convince yourself that the risk is manageable, the task achievable, or the pain worthwhile, not because the objective data guarantees success, but because the alternative, paralysis rooted in absolute reality, is a guaranteed failure. The paradox is sharp. You must momentarily suspend belief in a current reality in order to achieve something truly believable in the future. You lie to your present self to empower your future self. Think about the way procrastination manifests in your daily life. Often, it is not sheer laziness. It is the observer whispering the overwhelming truth. This task is massive. The effort required is painful. You are inadequate for this complexity. The strategic response is a deliberate, small deception. I will only work for 5 minutes. That 5 minutes is a lie you tell the observer. It tricks the actor into initiating momentum. Or consider facing immense emotional pressure or personal grief. You tell yourself, I can handle this. I am fine. when every fiber screams the opposite. This is not shallow, brittle optimism. It's an application of powerful strategic will, using a chosen internal narrative to bypass immediate emotional shock and sustain core functionality until you cross the psychological threshold of competence or acceptance. When you begin to master the use of the necessary fiction, you shift your identity from being merely a reactor to circumstance to becoming an intentional architect of your own internal states. The psychological impact is profound. You realize that truth isn't just something passively discovered, it is often actively forged. You gain the terrifying freedom to choose which realities you will inhabit and fight for. But let this serve as your final strategic warning. The boundary between necessary, strategic self-deception and detrimental self-delusion is razor thin. The master strategist knows precisely when to let the fiction dissolve and allow the cold, objective truth back in for recalculation. The amateur lets the comforting lie become their permanent psychological prison. Sleep now, knowing this. The secret to conquering the world, or even just the next day, often begins with the difficult and subtle art of strategically deceiving the one person who knows all your weaknesses, you. N. The terrain of others. Understanding where your feet must never tread. Let us consider the wisdom of the untouched field. The concept we explore tonight is the strategic withdrawal from the internal territory of others. How much energy do you exhaust daily trying to redesign landscapes that were never meant for your blueprint? Rest now and acknowledge the deep exhaustion that comes from attempting to govern foreign souls. This pursuit, this constant urge to correct, clarify, or conquer the mind of another is the most common strategic failure of the modern self. It is a war of attrition fought on terrain where victory is impossible and where even a perceived win is merely the temporary suppression of a sovereign will. Strategic thinking, particularly in the realm of deep quietude, understands that the most crucial terrain is often the one you choose not to occupy. This isn't cowardice. It is the highest form of operational efficiency. It means recognizing that the emotional, moral, and historical architecture of another human being, their inner terrain, is sovereign ground. You may visit, you may advise, you may extend aid across the border, but you are forbidden from setting up permanent governance. The moment you mistake empathy for jurisdiction, you have already lost the battle for your own sanity. Imagine the soul of another person as a complex, high-altitude ecosystem, a dense, sprawling forest under a constant private meteorological system. You enter this space carrying a map, naturally, but that map is drawn entirely from the topography of your own experience. You observe the paths they take, see the clearings you believe should be made, and notice the species, the beliefs, the habits, the deeply held contradictions that should, in your objective analysis, be called for efficiency. But your map is useless here. The moment you decide to take control, to forcibly clear their underbrush or transplant your preferred ideology, you are not acting as a gardener, but as a colonist. And colonization always breeds resentment, resistance, and ultimately, failure for the occupier. The paradox of this territorial struggle is that we usually trespass with the best intentions. We cross the border because we genuinely believe we possess the clearer light, the better truth, or the protective shield against their inevitable mistakes. We confuse care with control, but control is a finite resource. And every unit of energy you spend trying to correct another person's internal compass, be they a child, a partner, or a colleague, is a unit diverted from navigating your own essential storm. This strategic oversight is costly. You are diverting your strongest defenses to a location that cannot be held. The deeper truth is that the terrain of others only seems strategically attractive when you are seeking distraction from the necessary, difficult reconstruction of your own foundations. We meddle when we fear confronting our own maplessness. Think about your recent history. Where did you attempt to adjust reality through sheer force of will directed at an external agent? Was it the endless loop of commentary you wanted to leave on someone else's fundamental choices? Was it the silent, exhausting mental battle to make your partner finally see the world through your lens of empirical logic? Every time you step onto that foreign soil, attempting to change their core programming, you become profoundly vulnerable. You invite active counterattack, or worse, passive resistance, the most demoralizing form of strategic defeat, where they yield outwardly but remain stubbornly, privately unchanged. When you finally initiate this strategic withdrawal, recognizing the sanctity of their sovereign ground, two profound psychological changes occur. First, you honor their autonomy, allowing them the dignity of their own struggle and the unique lessons that only their self-generated errors can provide. This is the ultimate act of respect, and it is the only foundation upon which genuine influence can ever be built. Second, and perhaps more importantly, you reclaim a vast reservoir of psychological capital. Your borders solidify. You realize that your strategic mission is not to manage the chaotic movements of the world, but simply to manage your focused, internal response to it. Peace is not the absence of external conflict, it is the absolute certainty that you are only accountable for the territory within your own skull. This realization is power. Allow the untamed forest of others to stand. Recognize that true victory lies not in the territory gained, but in the territory wisely ignored. The greatest strategy is sometimes to look away, to silence the urge to meddle, and to allow the profound quiet of non-interference to settle deep within your strategic heart. Sleep now, knowing your true power lies in the boundaries you choose to maintain, and in the quiet strength of your own, well-defended ground. We're halfway through this journey. Maybe you've closed your eyes, but your mind is still learning. Subscribe now, and stay with us for what's coming next. Momentum. The illusion of control over an unseen tide. We are discussing the phenomenon of strategic inertia, or what feels like momentum, and why it is often the most dangerous form of self-deception in war, business, and personal life. Think about the days you felt most effective, most successful. Did you feel like you were forcing the river, wrestling the banks into submission, or did you simply feel like you were surfing a massive, invisible current? You might feel exhausted right now, perhaps slightly burned out, but you keep moving. Why? Because deep down, stopping requires a form of courage far greater than continuation. Continuation is simply physics. Stopping requires strategic reckoning. Momentum, in the strategic sense, is not merely speed. It is the built-up kinetic energy of decisions already made, forces already aligned. Sun Tzu called it Shi, the configuration of power, the potential energy inherent in the landscape. Momentum is what happens when you've successfully placed your stone high on the hill, and now gravity is doing the heavy lifting. The strategic master must understand this critical distinction. Is the current you are riding your current designed and leveraged by you, or is it merely the universal drift toward entropy? Imagine you are navigating a vast, dark ocean in a small vessel. For hours, your body strains against the oars, tracking what you believe is due north. Your muscles burn. You feel the satisfying, visceral momentum of your effort. You look down at the current map, the objective reality, and realize the shocking, demoralizing truth. An unseen, powerful tide is pulling your small vessel southeast at twice the speed of your rowing. Your actions, your effort, have been rendered strategically irrelevant by a force you failed to measure. The illusion is not that you are moving, but that your effort dictates the trajectory. You are mistaking the tide's movement for your own achieved velocity. You confuse exertion with direction. Why do we cling so desperately to this illusion? Because control is a psychological necessity, and momentum is the comforting evidence of control. When we are moving fast, we don't have to endure the paralyzing question, where exactly are we going? We only have to celebrate, look how fast we are going. Momentum shields us from the anxiety of strategic reassessment. It becomes a psychological mechanism, a way to outsource responsibility for direction to the speed itself. The paradox is devastating. The faster you move in the wrong direction, the more validated the strategic failure becomes, because you are proving how effective you are at moving the wrong way. The deeper the rut, the more convinced you become that you just need a bigger shovel to get out. The true strategist knows that sometimes the most aggressively powerful move is to stop, to drift consciously, to take the true temperature of the tide before expending a single calorie of personalized effort. Look at your professional life, your personal habits, even your social cycles. Are you operating purely on momentum right now? Are you working 60 hours a week because those tasks are clearly leading you toward a defined, desirable strategic future? Or are you working 60 hours a week simply because that is the established rhythm of your inertia? We perpetually confuse busyness with purpose. The world rewards velocity but rarely checks the compass bearing. You are praised, elevated, and rewarded for your relentless forward motion, even if that motion is simply carrying you further and further away from the coastline you intended to reach years ago. It feels productive because the kinetic energy is high, but it is often just strategic resignation disguised as hustle. The realization that you are merely being carried, that your frantic rowing is an elaborate, draining pantomime, can bring an enormous, frightening stillness. But this stillness is where true power is forged. Strategic mastery is not about generating momentum. It is about selecting the pre-existing momentum and placing yourself precisely within its current. It requires a profound, unsettling patience. It demands that you cease to be the primary engine of brute force and become, instead, the architect of position. You must learn to differentiate between the feeling of being powerfully carried by the strategy and the draining, relentless reality of dragging the strategy behind you. The difference between those two states is the difference between effortless dominance and eventual collapse. Do not ask how you can move faster. Ask instead, what unseen, massive current is already moving, and how can I stop struggling long enough to finally harness its power? Momentum is a beautiful, efficient servant, but it is a catastrophic, blindly destructive master. Remember this before you close your eyes and the world goes silent. Sometimes the hardest, most strategic work you can possibly do is to simply drop the oar and wait for the tide to turn. The fatal flaw of the impenetrable fortress, stagnation. We approach the 12th principle, one that addresses the ultimate paradox of security. We call this the fatal flaw of the impenetrable fortress, stagnation. It is the silent killer, the deepest trap set not by your enemies, but by the comforting facade of your own success and perceived completeness. Have you ever felt utterly secure in a professional position, a financial circumstance, or even a long-term relationship, only to watch that very foundation crumble not from external attack, but from internal rot? Settle into that strange, disturbing realization. What if the most dangerous enemy is not the one outside your well-built walls, but the cessation of purposeful, adaptive movement within them? True, enduring stability is never stillness. It is calibrated, continuous adaptation. Sun Tzu, speaking metaphorically of strategy, teaches that the perfect tactician is like water. Water seeks the path of least resistance, yet it is endlessly fluid, shapeless, and powerfully persistent. The moment water is perfectly contained, sealed off from external flow and internal movement, it ceases to be dynamic. It becomes potential energy waiting to sour, or to be overwhelmed by the crushing pressure it can no longer dissipate by shifting its form. Stagnation is the psychological state where strategic achievement, success, wealth, or power has eliminated the immediate felt need for vigilance, turning strategic victory into philosophical rigidity. You stop asking hard questions because the answer you already possess seems flawless and final. To understand this decay, imagine the greatest fortress ever conceived, walls kilometers thick, provisioned for decades, gates sealed against any conceivable assault. The inhabitants, feeling perfectly safe and assured, stop training, they stop scouting, they stop innovating their defenses because logically no one can breach the walls they already possess. They have achieved perfect physical security. But the world outside does not stop. Technology changes, climates shift, the long-forgotten internal systems, the plumbing, the ventilation, the governance, begin to break down under the weight of unchallenged inertia. The structure does not fall in a dramatic siege. It simply decays from the inside out, perfectly preserved in its obsolescence, a museum of a war that is no longer being fought. Here is the devastating strategic paradox. Achieving perfection kills the impulse toward improvement. When you become strategically dominant, the mind interprets ongoing effort, curiosity, and friction as wasteful overhead. Why train harder when you already win every conflict? This strategic comfort breeds a subtle, soft blindness. The mechanism of stagnation is fundamentally rooted in certainty. Certainty closes the feedback loop. We mistake the absence of immediate visible threats for the absence of change itself. We become victims of our own internal map, failing to notice that the territory has already shifted miles beneath our feet. You become excellent at fighting yesterday's war, ensuring that you are fundamentally unprepared for tomorrow's necessary peace or its unexpected battle. Think now about your own expertise, your routines, or those relationships that feel settled, those areas where you stopped investing active curiosity because the initial investment paid off so well. This is stagnation manifesting in your career, in your intellect, in your emotional landscape. The relationship that ultimately fails isn't usually destroyed by a sudden, violent trauma. It's quietly eroded by the assumption of permanence, the profound failure to actively maintain mutual curiosity. You stop seeking understanding. You stop challenging your assumptions about the other person or the market, believing the map of them you drew 5 years ago is still perfectly accurate. The emotional fortress, once built for shelter, becomes a lonely, airtight tomb. The ultimate psychological toll of stagnation is the slow creeping death of agency. When you stop moving, you hand your control and destiny over to the forces of entropy and time. You become strategically passive. The greatest shift in mindset occurs when you embrace the philosophy that nothing is permanently solved, and that every victory merely earns you the right to face a new, higher level, more complex problem. This perspective transforms security from a static achievement into a dynamic daily practice. It means recognizing that the most reliable system, the most resilient self, is the one designed for self-disruption and constant subtle evolution, the one that welcomes the stress test, even when no visible external threat exists. This is true strategic resilience, the refusal to rest on a foundation you suspect might already be obsolete. The ultimate lesson of the fortress that stands eternally is that it must never truly stand still. It must breathe, rebuild, and re-engineer its own structure constantly. Do not mistake stability for stillness. Remember this as you sink into the quiet. Security is not a state of being, but the continuous, subtle art of becoming. The greatest defense you can ever build is always the flexibility of the mind that refuses to be absolutely contained. The inner spy, when intuition is the only reliable betrayal, the strategy of the unseen battlefield. You have done the math. You have checked the variables. You have consulted the data, followed the rules of engagement, and plotted the course of least resistance. Yet, here you are, suspended in the dark silence before sleep, feeling the cold current of doubt moving beneath the surface of your certainty. What if the best strategy, the maneuver that saves you from collapse, is the one you haven't consciously written down, the one that contradicts the very architecture of your current life plan? The inner spy is that strategic shadow. It is the intelligence you gathered while you weren't looking, the aggregated truth compressed beneath the noise of logic. In the cold light of day, we trust systems, flowcharts, and external proofs of concept. But as the world darkens and you prepare to surrender to rest, the spy submits its findings. This intuition reveals that the strongest walls you built are precisely where the enemy should attack, or perhaps that the life you planned is the one you need to dismantle. This is the moment when calculation ceases to be useful and mere knowing takes over. In Sun Tzu's strategic thinking, there is the concept of Li, the principle, the established form, and Shi, the potential, the momentum. The inner spy does not care about Li, the established truth of your spreadsheet or career trajectory. It operates entirely within Shi, assessing the unseen forces and the imminent kinetic energy of your future. It recognizes potential disaster or breakthrough long before the five senses have ratified the information. Imagine standing before the fork in the road. Path A is illuminated by logic, high probability, high yield, endorsed by every successful metric you have ever learned. Path B is dark, precarious, and economically nonsensical. But as you attempt to commit fully to Path A, your diaphragm tightens. A cold knot of resistance forms in your stomach. When you merely consider B, there is a subtle release, a sigh of resignation that strangely feels like relief. Your inner spy reports, Path A is a trap designed for the predictable mind. Choose B, where the absence of certainty is the only true competitive advantage. This is the core paradox. Intuition, in this sense, is the only reliable betrayal because it reliably betrays the comfortable lie you built for yourself. Your conscious, strategic self is heavily invested in maintenance, defense, and the preservation of the current ego structure. Your intuition, the spy, is solely focused on survival and adaptation, which often requires the total, terrifying destruction of the status quo. It betrays the plan because the plan is already obsolete, weighted down by yesterday's data. It's the moment when the strategic voice reminds us, all warfare is based on deception. And sometimes the ultimate deception is the one we practice upon ourselves, convincing ourselves we are safe when we are strategically exposed. How often do you sit right now, staring at the ceiling, analyzing the day's failures, knowing that the real failure wasn't in execution, but in ignoring the faint whisper you heard at dawn, that job you maintain, that relationship you cling to, that project you know is hollow? You rationalize staying because the external metrics were fine. You convince the conscious general to ignore the spy, believing that calculation was safer than primal, inconvenient truth. But now, as the defenses weaken in the quiet of the night, the spy submits its final, devastating report. The only way forward is the route that causes the most immediate internal discomfort. To accept the inner spy's report is to understand that true strategic alignment is not coherence between your actions and your planned goals, but coherence between your actions and your deepest, often inconvenient, knowing. It means realizing that the ultimate art of war is not against others, but against the heavily fortified garrison of your own denial. When you allow this betrayal, this fundamental rejection of the comfort zone, you stop fighting yourself. You transition from merely managing consequences to living consequence. The anxiety of uncertainty gives way to the dread of definite purpose. This is strategic maturity, accepting that the map of your mind is more important than the map of the world. The greatest move you can make is always internal. Sleep is not a surrender, it is an internal security review. Listen now, for the whispers that defy your checklist. The strategy that truly saves you will always feel like the one that dismantles you first. The final deception is this: trust the feeling that makes you most afraid. It is the only honest witness. The 5 fatal flaws: how we volunteer our own defeat. Tonight, we turn the gaze inward, away from the enemy line, toward the structural weaknesses within the self. We are searching for the 5 fatal flaws, the specific, subtle mechanisms through which you volunteer your own defeat long before the first verifiable threat ever materializes. Pause and consider this deep, uncomfortable truth. Have you ever noticed that your most catastrophic defeats rarely come from external force, but rather from a moment of exhausted impatience, a flash of unchecked pride, or a quiet internal panic? The external world merely presents the obstacle. It is your internal friction, your chosen reaction, that loads the chamber and pulls the trigger. The universe rarely defeats you. You generally agree to the terms of your own surrender. In the art of war, these flaws are treated not as moral failings, but as critical strategic liabilities. They are the holes in your armor that your opponent doesn't need to aim for. They simply wait for you to expose them through stress. Sun Tzu names the 5 traps that destroy a general faster than any opposing army, and they are traps born paradoxically of excess virtue. Too much bravery, too much loyalty, too much sensitivity. They are the subtle ways the human heart undermines the strategic mind. Imagine the self not as a simple defense structure, but as a heavily fortified structure riddled with fail-safe mechanisms installed by the architect, your own subconscious, designed to blow the doors inward if the stress levels exceed a certain unmanaged threshold. The enemy is not attacking the walls. They are simply pressing your fail-safe button, and you have configured the explosive charge. Let us confront these 5 specters, the architectures of self-sabotage. First, there is recklessness. This is the general who cannot wait, the leader driven by emotional impatience rather than calculation. This is when courage bleeds into arrogance, urging you to commit resources, time, or emotion before the conditions are right, simply because the feeling of inaction is intolerable. You lose control when you confuse speed with progress. Second, cowardice. This is the paralyzing opposite. It is the failure to seize the 1% chance because you cannot tolerate the 99% risk. Cowardice is often disguised as prudence or analysis paralysis. It's the fear of public failure becoming more important than the pursuit of necessary success. It causes you to forfeit opportunity because you are unwilling to pay the emotional cost of conflict. Third, the quick temper or irritability. This is the simplest and most common manipulation tool available to those who oppose you. When your emotions are volatile, you become a puppet whose strings are pulled by minor slights. Being triggered is the moment you volunteer control of your mental bandwidth and strategic timing to the person who knows how to press your buttons, giving them, entirely free of charge, access to your critical decision-making loop. Fourth, sensitivity to honor or excessive pride. This is allowing minor disrespect, a perceived insult, or a trivial slight to necessitate a major, costly war. You become captive to reputation, prioritizing how others perceive your immediate strength over the preservation of your long-term resources. True power understands that sometimes the greatest strength is accepting a minor, temporary humiliation to preserve the ability to win the ultimate objective. And finally, the 5th flaw, over-compassion or excessive worry about subordinates. This is the inability to make necessary, cold, objective decisions because you are emotionally entangled with the potential pain the decision will inflict on others, be they employees, family members, or colleagues. While compassion is a virtue, when it prevents necessary restructuring, necessary departures, or necessary suffering, it ceases to be a virtue and becomes a strategic drain. It ties your fate to the comfort level of the periphery, ensuring the core remains exposed. We do not command armies today, but we command resources, time, and emotional energy. When the inevitable stress arrives, the aggressive email, the stalled career, the difficult conversation, do you respond with recklessness, sending the immediate, harsh reply? When you delay making that critical, necessary change, are you succumbing to cowardice or over-worry? These flaws are the architecture of modern burnout, the silent engines of self-defeat. The profound realization embedded in this strategic lesson is that winning is not primarily about flawless execution. It is about relentless prevention. By identifying the architecture of self-sabotage, you shift the locus of control entirely inward. The goal isn't to be immune to emotion, but to ensure that the predictable patterns of the human heart are predictable only to you. You cannot eliminate the human heart, but you can rigorously study its 5 cardinal weaknesses. Understand the 5 ways you volunteer your own defeat. For tonight, let the only battle you fight be the silent, necessary war against the traitor within the gates of your own mind. The illusion of fervor, weaponizing the emotional self. Have you ever felt utterly convinced, driven by a passion so absolute it seemed to define reality, only to realize upon reflection that the conviction itself was the most effective part of your strategy? Tonight we consider the architecture of intentional intensity, the dangerous beauty of controlled passion, and the cost of deploying the emotional self as a weapon. The illusion of fervor is not merely hypocrisy, it is strategic theater of the highest order. Fervor, when viewed through the lens of strategic thinking, is rarely the pure, spontaneous combustion of the soul. It is often a carefully modulated frequency, a weapon of strategic opacity designed to mask hesitation, calculation, or fundamental weakness. The true master of power understands that belief, when manufactured and projected outwards with unshakable certainty, becomes a formidable tool for destabilization or mobilization. It's the art of appearing wholly committed so that others mistake your performance for destiny. Imagine the strategist who needs to buy crucial time or redefine the terms of surrender. They don't retreat meekly. They stage a devastating, dramatic, yet ultimately futile last stand. The apparent fervor, the desperate cries, the defiant sacrifice, the overwhelming commitment to a doomed cause isn't about achieving victory. It's about exhausting the enemy's psychological reserves. It convinces them that this fight is too costly, or creates an overwhelming narrative of tragic strength that demoralizes the victor in the aftermath. The flames look real. The heat is palpable, but they are fed by calculated fuel, measured precisely to achieve a desired psychological burn rate. You are not fighting to win. You are fighting to shift the focus from your vulnerability to your perceived emotional indestructibility. The mechanism hinges on what we call internal mirroring. To weaponize fervor effectively, you must first convince your inner self of the urgency and the necessity of this emotional display. You must silence the quiet observer, that detached part of your consciousness that knows the score, the risk, and the underlying objective. The tension lies precisely here. The stronger the strategic purpose, the deeper the feigned emotional commitment must be. This requires a peculiar form of self-violation for external victory. You sacrifice your clarity for the intoxicating haze of manufactured certainty, ensuring that your own eyes reflect the madness you intend to inspire in others. You are not simply acting, you are immersing yourself in the constructed reality until the boundaries blur. This is the ultimate strategic cost. You become the emotional narrative you are trying to sell, at least temporarily. In the modern theater of influence, the endless digital scroll, this mechanism operates at scale, achieving instantaneous combustion. Look at the performance of instantaneous, absolute conviction in digital spaces, where nuance is weakness and ambiguity is treason. This is weaponized fervor distilled. We are rarely arguing for truth. We are projecting an unassailable emotional fortress, signaling purity and commitment to our tribe. You see this dynamic in corporate negotiations, in hyper-loyal brand advocacy, and perhaps most vividly, in manufactured outrage. The goal is not consensus or understanding, but the establishment of an emotional hierarchy where the most intensely convinced, or seemingly so, dictates the terms of engagement and silences dissent simply by out-projecting emotional heat. The psychological toll of living this strategy is devastating, both for the wielder and the recipient. When you consistently leverage synthetic fervor, you begin to distrust your own emotional compass. Is this moment of genuine joy authentic, or merely a posture designed to elicit trust? Is this moment of anger righteous, or a strategic leverage point to gain ground? The self becomes fundamentally fissured, split between the authentic core and the performing mask. You lose the ability to differentiate the spontaneous spark of feeling from the controlled, directed flame of strategy. For the receiver, the constant exposure to weaponized conviction breeds profound cynicism, turning genuine emotional depth into suspicion. We become emotional auditors, constantly searching for the strategic motive behind every expression of intensity. We trade intimacy for armor, unable to risk believing in the purity of another's passion. Perhaps the true strategic victory, the highest level of mastery, is not in projecting the blaze that consumes the enemy, but in maintaining absolute stillness and clarity at the core of the storm. Because the most dangerous illusion is believing that the fire you started outside hasn't already consumed the landscape inside you. Sleep now, and ask yourself which emotions you genuinely own and which are merely borrowed for the performance. The indirect path, why the long way round, is often the quickest exit. The calculus of detours, the strategic necessity of retreat, You lie here, waiting for the clarity to arrive, waiting for the path ahead to clear itself. But what if the path is only truly revealed when you deliberately step off of it? We often confuse inertia with progress, believing that the continuous, visible application of force is the only measure of our commitment. We are taught that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and our ambition demands that we sprint it. But the strategist, the one who truly understands the nature of conflict, whether external or internal, knows that the greatest act of power is often not the advance, but the intentional step back. What if the long way round is in fact the quickest exit? We are inherently programmed for linearity. If A is the problem, B must be the direct solution. This is the logic of immediate gratification, the logic of the soldier who charges the machine gun nest because he believes courage negates physics. Sun Tzu, examining the eternal physics of power, offered a frightening counterpoint. She, the strategic power derived from positioning, not brute force. The indirect path is not cowardice. It is the conservation of energy until the terrain itself dictates the outcome. It means allowing time and circumstance to erode the obstacle you cannot yet overcome, leveraging patience as a primary weapon. The direct path tests your endurance. The indirect path tests your wisdom. Consider the river flowing toward the granite cliff. If the water maintained absolute linear ambition, it would simply pile up against the stone, frozen by its own rigidity. It would achieve nothing but stasis. Instead, the river spreads, finding the microscopic crack, the gentle slope, the path of least resistance. It doesn't fight the stone, it surrounds the stone. It uses gravity and time as its allies, relying on volume and repetition to achieve its goal. It takes the detour, moving seemingly miles out of its way, yet eventually, the cumulative effect of those tiny circumventions carves the canyon itself. Its goal is the ocean, not the immediate triumph over the cliff face. This is where the demanding, immediate ego rebels. The direct path feels honest, tangible, and visible. The detour feels like failure, like wasted time, or worst of all, like a public admission of inadequacy. We fear the judgment of pause. But the strategic genius understands that the friction of a direct attack is a crushing tax on your resources and your psychological endurance. The mechanism of the indirect path involves identifying and maximizing the void, the unseen opportunity created precisely when you stop pushing. You are not running from the difficulty, you are using the difficulty's own mass and rigidity against it. You allow the tension to build elsewhere. The indirect path is the quiet accumulation of power on the periphery, while the opposing force remains fixed and exhausted, waiting for the direct attack that never arrives. Think of the project you are currently forcing, the relationship you are straining, the goal you are trying to muscle into existence. We often mistake repetition for effort. When you find yourself hitting the same emotional, professional, or creative wall for the third, fourth, or fifth time, that is the clear, unambiguous signal to pivot, not to push harder. Sometimes the quickest way to get the raise is not to demand it, but to quietly acquire the expertise that makes you irreplaceable to a competing entity, thus forcing the issue indirectly. Sometimes the fastest way to solve an intractable personal conflict is to simply give it room to breathe, allowing the opponent's emotional energy and initial conviction to dissipate into the atmosphere of neglect. You turn the opponent's certainty into their primary vulnerability. The profound adoption of the indirect path shifts your psychological axis from frantic execution to calm observation. You stop seeing yourself as a battering ram defined by the hardness of the surfaces you meet, and you start seeing yourself as a fluid navigator defined by the adaptability of your flow. It is the realization that the fastest route between 2 points is rarely a straight line, because the terrain of human endeavor is never flat. This strategic patience allows you to metabolize failures not as existential defeats, but as vital reconnaissance data informing the next necessary detour. You learn to trust the long arc of time, understanding that if you cannot win the initial battle, you must win the war of positioning. You cannot conquer what you cannot circumvent. The long way round is not a concession, it is a superior tactical advantage. The moment you stop rushing toward the solution, driven by the urgency of the ego, is often the very moment the solution, having finally been given the necessary space and time, begins rushing, quietly and inevitably toward you. The doctrine of water, to yield, is to remain unbroken. We are constantly taught that strength is rigidity. We define resilience by how much force we can absorb without breaking, how long we can hold an unyielding posture against the friction of the world. But have you ever felt the profound exhaustion that comes from perpetually fighting a current, from maintaining that hard, taut stiffness? What if the highest form of enduring strength, the secret strategy for remaining whole, lies in absolute and strategic softness? This is the central argument of the ancient doctrine of water. To yield is to remain unbroken. It is the tactical humility of the Taoist warrior and the strategic genius of Sun Tzu applied to your deepest inner conflicts. We misunderstand yielding. We associate it with surrender, with failure, with loss of territory. But in true strategic thinking, yielding is not passive resignation. It is the most profound form of active, non-resistant positioning. Water is the only element that can be simultaneously formless and absolutely devastating, seemingly harmless and yet capable of carving canyons. When intense pressure comes, do you stiffen and guarantee a breaking point, or do you dissolve and guarantee continuity? Picture a fast-moving mountain stream, full of kinetic energy, navigating the terrain. It encounters a massive, unmoving boulder placed squarely in its path. The stone stands firm, believing it has won the physical confrontation by sheer mass and rigidity. The water does not argue. It doesn't smash itself repeatedly against the granite edge until it turns to mist. It simply divides, flows around, and immediately reunites on the other side, perpetually whole. The water yields completely to the stone's temporary presence. But observe that stone, not in the moment of impact, but 100 years later. The rigid granite is diminished, smoothed, worn down, defined now by the constant soft pressure of the water that never fought back directly, that never lost its own essential nature. The stone yielded its form through attrition. The water maintained its formlessness and endured eternally. This is the strategic paradox that defines longevity. The moment you become rigid, you create a single, clear leverage point for any force acting against you, whether that force is a competitor, a crisis, or intense emotional pressure. Rigidity is brittle. It guarantees a catastrophic point of failure under maximum stress. When you choose the path of water, radical flexibility and non-attachment to a single form, you distribute the pressure across your entire being. You become psychologically unhittable, not because you blocked the blow, but because you were never fully there to be hit. The conflict moves through you, channeling its momentum harmlessly, rather than accumulating in you as trauma or bitterness. Think now about the unnecessary battles you fight daily. The argument with the automated system, the frustration over a minor traffic delay, the bureaucratic red tape that feels designed purely to antagonize you. Your impulse is to meet resistance with equal force, demanding justice or swift resolution. But what if you saw every point of friction as an opportunity to practice flow? To yield to the circumstances to preserve your most finite resource, your internal focused energy. It is strategic conservation. You allow minor conflicts to pass you by, saving your rigidity, your structure, your refusal to compromise, only for the matters that genuinely demand permanent foundation. By giving in gracefully on the small things, you retain the power to shape the large ones. The psychological impact of fully adopting the water doctrine is profound. You stop viewing external obstacles as personal affronts or evidence of your weakness. You begin to see them simply as topographical features that define your current route. Fear and anger are nothing more than the internal emotional manifestations of rigidity, the absolute refusal to yield, the desperate need for things to be otherwise than they are. When you learn to flow, you free yourself from the exhausting tyranny of needing to control everything outside of your own consciousness. You achieve a quiet, self-sustaining power, the kind that doesn't require external validation or performative victories. You simply exist, adapting your shape to the vessel that contains you, yet always carrying the full force of your potential energy. To master strategy, you must first master softness. Remember this before the final darkness settles over your thoughts. The stiff, proud tree breaks in the storm. The yielding reed bends to the earth and survives. In the deepest wisdom of strategic power, the truest victory is not conquering the obstacle, but becoming the shape the obstacle currently demands of you so that you might flow onward, perpetually unbroken. The real tax of triumph. What a visible victory always conceals the price of elevation, the hidden gravity of visible triumph. You finally stood on the platform, didn't you? That moment where the spotlight found you, where the metrics affirmed your effort, and the world momentarily held its breath just for you. It was intoxicating, but tell me honestly, when the roar of the crowd finally faded, when the congratulations stopped flooding the screen, what profound, echoing silence was left behind? We spend our lives chasing the visible affirmation of victory. We seek the elevation, the recognition that separates us from the quiet majority. Yet, Sun Tzu, in his profound, chilling realism, understood that the greatest weakness of any position is not tactical failure, but psychological and strategic exposure. A visible victory is not a conclusion, it is a tactical announcement. It forces every competitor, every rival, and every latent enemy to immediately recalculate their strategy against you. It marks the transition from being the strategic hunter to becoming the known, stationary target. The true, unavoidable cost of visibility is the elimination of neutrality. Consider the ancient lighthouse keeper. His purpose is selfless, to guide ships, illuminating the path and preventing catastrophe on the rugged coast. But by absolute necessity, the light that saves the friendly ships is also the first thing the pirate or the enemy fleet targets in the dark. The light is essential for success, yet its very brilliance attracts the opposition that seeks to extinguish it. You become the undeniable landmark, the fixed coordinates that others must use, either to navigate safely past you or to eliminate you entirely. The paradox inherent in this structure is the terrible reciprocity of admiration and envy. When you succeed quietly, maintaining operational security and humility, you manage risk internally. When you succeed visibly, loudly, and publicly, you buy influence and temporary validation, but you pay for it instantly in the currency of constant draining vigilance. Triumph introduces friction. The higher you rise above the common grade, the more severe the structural stress placed upon your supporting mechanisms, your relationships, your time, your resources, and most critically, your internal peace. The visible victory strips you of the comfortable right to error. The subtle mechanism, the real tax collected by the world, is this. Victory is rarely a reward paid in cash. It is usually a debt note. The world congratulates you publicly for what you have achieved, but it immediately begins demanding collateral, proof that you deserve the future success you now owe them. The expectation of perpetual success becomes heavier than the original struggle to achieve it. This tax manifests in modern life as the expectation treadmill. That promotion, that launch, that highly successful project, it was not a finish line. It was simply a new starting gun, arbitrarily set 10 levels higher. You are no longer judged by the quality of your baseline work, but by the relentless maintenance of your dominance. The visible win makes your past accomplishments obsolete, forcing an endless, accelerating requirement for novelty and magnitude in your future endeavors. The real erosion, the philosophical drain, happens internally. You learn, with a painful, sharp clarity, that applause is temporary, conditional, and deeply impersonal. It creates a psychological trap where you begin to mistake the attention for the achievement. The tax of triumph is the subtle corruption of your internal metric. You start unconsciously chasing the noise, the visibility, and the validation, rather than preserving the quiet, focused difficulty that earned the initial success. You sacrifice sustainability for spectacle. True mastery isn't just about reaching the visible summit. It is about strategically managing the inevitable gravity of the fall, or the certainty of being pulled upon. The deepest strategic insight is knowing that the moment the world sees your light, You must already be plotting your next quiet, necessary move back into the shadow. Success is the visibility you earn. Wisdom is the invisibility you preserve. Authority without volume, the resonance of unspoken command. Let's consider, as the noise of the day fades and the silence of the ceiling replaces the rush of the world, what truly constitutes lasting influence. Is it the shouting voice, the frantic urgency, the pounding fist demanding attention? Or is it the quality of stillness you carry, a stillness so profound that the room must reorient itself around your presence? This is the central paradox we explore now. Authority without volume, the resonance of unspoken command. Sun Tzu rarely instructs us on the direct application of brute force. His focus is on Shi, the configuration of strategic power, the potential energy built into your position before the engagement even begins. Authority without volume is the mastery of this latent power. It is the realization that your existence, stable and deeply rooted, changes the calculus of the room. You do not need to announce your worth. You are the established value. To understand this, imagine a deep mountain lake late at night. The surface is perfectly still, reflecting the remote stars with absolute clarity. There is no splash, no ripple, yet you know the depth is immense and the water is cold, heavy, holding an ecosystem beneath its mirror skin. The surface doesn't need to scream its depth. Its stillness communicates the overwhelming volume held within. This is the posture you are seeking to inhabit. You are seeking to become that lake, vast, contained, and undeniably present. We are trained by a loud world to measure our worth in decibels and our conviction in speed. The mechanism of silent authority requires a severe internal subtraction, the removal of the chronic, exhausting need to be heard. Most people speak to prove they exist. The master of silent command only speaks when their words hold definitive strategic weight. The paradox is cruel, yet liberating. Your authority increases exponentially the moment you surrender the desire to enforce it. When you don't need permission to exist, when you don't need external validation for your truth, your words become scarce and therefore priceless. The tension lies in restraining the ego's primitive urge to react immediately, to defend itself, to fill the uncomfortable silence. Most people fear silence because it forces them to confront the instability of their own position. Authority, without volume, weaponizes that silence, not as a punishment, but as a deliberate strategic void. In the modern digital echo chamber, everyone is projecting their voice 24/7, trapped in a continuous loop of self-advertisement. To master authority without volume is to consciously resist this constant performance. It means understanding that the most strategic move in a heated, low-stakes argument is often not a rebuttal, but a profound, centered silence that forces the other party to listen, perhaps for the first time, to the sound of their own rushing pulse. You refuse to engage in a battle of noise. You compel the confrontation to occur on the plane of gravitas. This deep integration of silent authority rearranges your interior world. You cease being a reactive surface, constantly buffeted by external demands and opinions, and you become the deep, unmoving current that dictates the temperature of the surrounding waters. The fear of being ignored vanishes because you realize that the absence of response, the patient, unblinking observance, often implies massive respect and caution, not dismissal. When you refuse to shout, the world must lean in to listen. When you choose stillness over frenzy, you gain an immense temporal advantage, allowing others to exhaust their energy while you remain positioned, intact, and ready. You learn that power is not how far your voice carries, but how closely others must approach you to understand your terms. True authority is not the sound you make when you arrive, but the profound vacuum left when you depart. You don't need to raise your voice to raise the stakes. You only need to know, without question, the weight of your own stillness. The final strategy, the absolute power found in letting go. The art of strategic surrender, the empty vessel. Have you ever noticed the fundamental paradox of rest, that the harder you try to fall asleep, the more stubbornly wakefulness grips you. Tonight, as we conclude our strategic journey, we step onto the final, most essential battleground, the willingness to lose in order to truly win. Sun Tzu's most profound wisdom isn't about crushing the enemy through overwhelming force. It's about mastering the terrain of non-resistance and leveraging stillness. We define letting go not as weakness, resignation, or failure, but as the ultimate, most sophisticated strategic withdrawal. It is the clear-eyed acknowledgement that certain battles, especially the internal ones fought against silence, against the necessary descent into rest, cannot be won by active, violent effort. Their true capture requires emptiness. You must become a container, ready to receive stillness, rather than an agent trying to forge it. Consider the metaphor of the master archer. The target is clear, the focus intense, the bow taut. But true mastery is not found in the violent pull of the string, nor in the striving intention. It is found in the absolute stillness just before the release. The power of the shot is not held in the archer's muscle. It is channeled through the absence of effort, through the brief and necessary surrender of control. The arrow finds its mark precisely because the archer ceases to exist as an interfering, anxious entity. You are that archer, and rest is your mark. Tonight, your task is to stop trying to force the trajectory. Here lies the central, unsettling paradox of modern consciousness. We spend our entire waking lives accumulating control, gathering actionable strategies, analyzing and exerting willpower. We fundamentally believe that power resides in holding fast and maintaining vigilance. But as the lights dim and you lie here awaiting the necessary shift, these accumulated strategies become the primary internal enemy. The noise in your head, the continuous reviewing of the day, the meticulous planning for tomorrow, the regretful rehearsal of past dialogue is the active, muscular resistance to the inevitable surrender required by sleep. To let go is to disarm this internal army of the self, to instruct your reviewing consciousness to stand down. It means consciously choosing not to engage with the compelling, exhausting drama of your own narrative until the dawn arrives. It demands a moment of profound, quiet courage, the courage to stand nakedly before the unknown threshold of unconsciousness, trusting the systemic process over your personal, striving intent. Right now, feel the physical manifestation of this remaining resistance. Scan your body for residual vigilance. Perhaps your jaw is subtly clenched, or your shoulders remain slightly raised, still gripping the day's weight and responsibility. Modern, ambitious life trains us for relentless effort. It makes relaxation feel akin to failure, like wasted, unproductive time. We mistake friction for value, yet true strategic thinking dictates that vital resources must be absolutely preserved. Your most precious resource right now is the mental clarity you will need tomorrow. You cannot earn that clarity through willpower tonight. You must accept it as the natural, profound consequence of strategic inaction now. Gently release the micromanager in your mind. When you commit to this strategic letting go, the psychological impact is immediately revolutionary. You shift roles entirely. You are no longer the active agent struggling fiercely against the current. You become the passive, highly astute observer watching the current flow past you. This is not apathy. This is the acceptance of intrinsic limits. It dissolves the persistent illusion of total 24/7 self-control. This act of surrender aligns you with the greater, deeper natural rhythm, the unavoidable cycle that governs rest and necessary activity. It is the final realization that the greatest power move available to you now is ultimately subtraction. What can you consciously subtract from your field of consciousness right now to make immediate room for stillness? Do not fight the dark, simply dissolve the self into it. The war for the day is over. Your absolute, unwavering power tonight lies not in what you desperately grasp, but in what you finally and irrevocably release. Let the silence claim its territory. If you reach this far, you're one of the few who stayed conscious until the end. Write, "I know the secret" in the comments, and share this reflection forward.